All right.
Oh man. Hey Chris.
Hey, how's it
Man,
going?
good. I feel
Good.
like I can just stretch out in front of you a little bit. This is fun.
Hey,
I
let's
love I love pulling up the chair and just chatting.
so good. Hey, let's get right into it. Pulling up something there. What are you drinking? What's
Mm.
on the menu today?
Oh, you caught me mid sip. And this is, so this was a new Costco special. So I
Okay.
still kind of have the jury out on it. It's called Legent.
Okay.
It's a blend. What it is, it's an American bourbon, but it's blended by a Japanese master blender.
Hello.
Yeah, so they flew him over because Japanese whiskey is just hot on the market. I mean, you really
Okay.
can't almost buy any pure Japanese whiskey these days because it's so rare,
Mm.
so valuable. In fact, maybe they've changed now, but a few years ago, the entire Japanese industry, which by the way is only 3 distilleries, put out a joint statement saying we're not going to produce any more what they call age statement whiskeys, right? So a 10-year, a 15-year, 21-year. They were only going to do blended whiskeys because their whiskey was in such high demand that they just could not supply based on name state
Really?
whiskey. So now, I mean, you can still buy some blended Japanese whiskeys, but honestly, it's bottom of the barrel stuff. The good any good Japanese whiskey is going to cost you anywhere from 150 to $400 a bottle.
Got it.
So,
And this is available at Costco.
well, no, this was Kentucky saying, hey, since they're in
Oh,
such high demand over there,
I
I
got it.
bet there's some master blenders who are bored right now because there's nothing to blend because it's still waiting to cure for another however many years before they can
Mm.
blend more. So they brought someone over to blend their stuff.
Okay.
So it's actually really affordably priced at Costco. So I thought
Okay.
I'd give it a try, and I like it. I like it. This is, I think, my second or third um, tasting of it, and it's quite a delight. Legion,
Okay.
yeah,
Legion. Okay. Fantastic. I mean, I guess it shouldn't surprise me that you don't think of Japan as being a whiskey connoisseur, but
right.
they do things very high quality over there. So I'm not sure why I'm surprised by that, but that's fantastic. That's really great. I today, not last time we chatted, it was a beetroot latte, and I will
Oh,
say that that is not in the mug today.
I still have nightmares about that beetroot latte, by the way.
You should. Oh,
So
you
what's it today, Chris?
Yeah, it's just I got a little chai tea
Mm,
going. Made a little bit of a kind of a latte out of it. Added a little bit of cream, kind of
mm.
accessing my European side. I put a little cream in my tea.
And I see your mug has a mustache on it too. For
My,
people listening who
yes,
can't see you.
very snooty with my mustache mug here. But of course, yeah. So got a little bit of chai tea going and a little bit of water there as well. So kind of keeping it pretty mild today. But yeah, let's jump right in. I love hearing what you're drinking. You're so much more sophisticated than I am. That's why I get to just learn about these things that I don't drink very much.
Perks of
Um,
boredom, Chris.
yeah, there we go. Well, hey, I've got some questions for you. We want to make these a conversation, and we're certainly going to do that. But today, I've been talking to a few folks. We've got some mutual friends in common, some mutual contacts, and wanted to take some time today just to help explore and unpack a little bit about you, the brand that you have, what you and Jen are doing there, where you guys are at in your world. And some of the questions have come around. If anybody follows you guys on social media or whatnot, or your brand, it's tenderly rooted. And I'm kind of curious about this. I know a little bit because I went to your website and read it, and we'll give the website here in a little bit. But can you unpack a little bit of how that came about? Like my kids and I were watching a lot of Marvel movies right now, so maybe give us the origin story of tenderly rooted, how that's going into a brand, and how all that's going.
Oh yeah, that's a good question, Chris. Um, well, it started back in 2015, really on accident. So as maybe most origins go, we didn't realize what we were kind of doing when the idea came to us, and it's been evolving and continues to evolve since. But it started with just a simple, hashtag post on an Instagram photo of our garden, right? That was it. And it was
Mm.
just, one of 10 or whatever, but something about it just kind of grabbed me. And then, that was in 2015. And then in 2017, still kind of just latently in the back of my head, I had this idea kind of rolling, and I think we'd bought the domain name by them, some other things. And, we didn't really have an icon for it. We didn't really have a brand image, something easily to communicate kind of who we were.
Mm.
And then in 2017, I was in Thailand, and I was at the night market in Chiang Mai up in the north. And, there's just all these street vendors, and I just blown by these street vendors. And a lot of them had t-shirts hung up, just packed with t-shirts. But one just, I mean, it just jumped off the street. There's a lot of sights and smells and delights, really, really wonderful things to catch your eye. But this in particular caught my eye. And it was a t-shirt, and it looked, I mean, as similar to our logo as it could be. I mean, I wish that there was a way to capture it better, because it was just such a passing thing. But
Mm.
it was this image of a tree that was a deer, that was a deer, that was a tree. And there was something about that image that, like, above all the noise and distraction of a busy street in Thailand, it said, this is the image.
Interesting.
And then in 2018, I read Parker Palmer's book, A Hidden Wholeness, which, I mean, just huge shout out. We talked about it on season 1 too, but like, there hasn't been a better description of what a soul is to me that I've ever come across than Parker Palmer, who's, I mean, he's a Quaker theologian, amazing, wise man.
Yeah.
Um, but he gives this image of what the soul is, and he gives it a few different ways. But this one in particular, there's this quote from the book that just haunts me, and so I'll read it so I don't get it wrong. But he says this. He says, "The soul is like a wild animal, tough, resilient, savvy, self-sufficient, and yet exceedingly shy. If we want to see a wild animal, the last thing we should do is go crashing through the woods, shouting for the creature to come out. But if we're willing to walk quietly into the woods and sit silently for an hour or two at the base of a tree, the creature we are waiting for may well emerge, and out of the corner of an eye, we'll catch a glimpse of the precious wildness we seek." And I love that picture, that the soul is this incredibly strong thing, and yet it emerges on its own terms, that it's exceedingly shy. And there's just, I was in leadership circles for a while, especially in church ministry, and we're talking about how do we encourage leaders? How do we have soulful leaders, really present leaders, really human leaders? And there's this built-in tension with soulfulness that shies away from the spotlight that leaders are always thrust into. So there's this image of like, okay, there's this idea that, when you're out, and we have deer all the time here in the orchard, and when we watch them quietly, we can watch them move. But as soon as we begin to move towards them, even when we're looking at them, they disappear.
Mm.
And there, it's this idea that a deer is the most ephemeral thing in the forest. One moment you see it, one moment you don't. And then you have that contrasted with a tree.
Mm.
A tree is the most certain, stable, reliable thing in a forest. My dad's been a farmer his entire life, and he always would joke with other farmers, particularly livestock farmers. And he'd say, well, the great thing about trees is that when I go on vacation and come back, they're right where I left them.
You hope. You hope
But
that's
that's
a
the
good, yeah.
truth about trees, right? You
Yeah.
can have a childhood home that had an oak tree in the backyard, and
Yeah.
you can come back 50 years later, 10 tenants later, and the whole house can be remodeled, and that oak tree is still standing,
Mm.
right? There's something about a tree that is just timeless, present,
Mm-hmm.
rooted, and unmovable. We have entire songs about the unshakable nature and the placedness of trees. And there's something about that evokes the soul for me. There's something about this eternal, like, bulwark of presence of what it means to be a soul-filled person, and to be a person engaging in the presence of soul.
Yeah.
And so there's these two things that feel, when we just talk about them in words, as though perhaps they're opposed to each other. But the beautiful thing about the soul is that it's this trans-rational existence, that it includes and surpasses and usurps rationality in its existence. It doesn't ask for rationality to justify itself, it simply exists. It is trans-rational. And so in that space, it's non-dualistic. So it can actually be both this shy deer that's ephemeral and this rooted tree that's persistent and present. And so then the blending of this, like we hired a graphic designer out of Argentina to help us with it, and she did a fantastic job. And I had this idea from Thailand in my head, and then we had some work ourselves on what it meant for us to be tenderly rooted.
Yeah.
Um, and so then this graphic designer took all that and put it in this image, which of course you can see on any of our merch or our website or anywhere else you go. And you can see this image of the deer's antlers become tree branches with leaves, and the deer's legs become roots underground. But the designer did this really cool thing that I think is brilliant, is she had the front foreleg of the deer lifted and the deer's head is swiveled backwards. So it gives the deer this look that it's ready to bolt at any moment. It's always on the edge of motion. And yet it's this tree with roots going down deep.
Wow. That's
So
fantastic.
I love, so to me, that is tenderly rooted.
Mm.
That whole expression of iconography and image and attachment to this concept, that is what it is to be tenderly rooted, from a very philosophical sense. And maybe, I don't know, maybe there's things we could talk about the practical things too, but that to me, that's the heartbeat of it. That's what it means to be tenderly rooted.
How is that translating to what you do day to day, how you approach? Because now that you're a farmer, you're out there in the field, you're out there with the trees, you're walking over the roots, right? Maybe you do see a deer fleeting off in the distance. Do you think about it on a daily basis, or is that something where it's just something to kind of go back to every now and then?
I think I do think about it if it's not daily, it's 5 days a week. I
Mm.
mean, it really is something that I carry with me. And, maybe not hour by hour, but usually at some point in the day, something happens and I'm reminded of it.
Yeah.
And it really is kind of centering and anchoring a reference point, for a lot of things. Yeah.
Yeah. Does it drive any value? Are there any values around that just kind of help center you during your day or during your week or during your month or during harvest or anything like that kind of
Oh,
brings you back?
during harvest, there's a lot of practical values that keep me sane, because harvest is a long, brutal season.
Yeah.
Uh, but there's it becomes, or is becoming, I should say, it is becoming this almost totalizing worldview,
Mm.
in that it's opening up channels of relationship to things and people and places and time, um, that I relate to it now on this different scale because I have the image to guide me.
Mm.
And I think that's one of the powerful things about religious iconography through time, is that it really gives us that visual language to move through the world. And so as I've been living into this image for the last couple of years, it's done the same thing for me. That it's given me, I've been able to see things differently the first time around, right?
Mm.
Instead of having to kind of chew through it and think through it a little bit to get somewhere,
Yeah.
which is not a frame of reference I had, maybe 5 or 6 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah. And I like that you said, it's been maybe a 5 or 6 year journey, that you've been walking through this. And so you mentioned a few words, and I'm so curious, why cultivate, and you've mentioned this, soil,
Mhm.
soul, and city together. How does that all blend?
Yeah, that's a fun tagline that also kind of emerged over time. Um, Yeah, maybe without going too much into the history of it, it wasn't always those three words, but I like soil, soul, and city because of the syllabants at the lead of the words. They're all four-letter words, and they have that,
It's hard to say quickly together.
right? I know, and I love it. Cultivate, soil, soul, and city. It's
Hmm.
fun. And then a lot of times people will misspell one or the other, so it'll either say soul, soul,
Soil,
or
soil,
soil,
yeah.
soil. Yeah. But it's so let's start with cultivate a little bit first. I had this moment, it was into our second year of farming, where I had this kind of aha, and honestly I'm sure it didn't come from inside of me because I just do so much listening to other people's wisdoms that I'm sure it came from someone else or is an amalgamation of other people's wisdom. But it struck me from within myself, this idea that I, my father, my neighbors, the entire country, there's not a single person who has ever grown a walnut.
Mm.
And I mean, no one's grown a tomato. No one's grown a cucumber, an avocado, a ear of corn. No one has ever grown any food.
Mm.
All we do is we set the environment for growth. That's it. That's the whole role of the farmer. And if you think about it, and this is true of every crop that I know of, and I could be wrong because there's a lot that I don't know. But so let's just focus on walnuts a little bit. When the walnut is actually growing on the tree, we work really hard to not touch the walnut.
Mm.
Everything we do is in harvest when we're actually reaping the fruit as it's fallen off the tree,
Right.
post harvest when we're doing all the winter cleanup, springtime as we're doing all laying the groundwork for all the nutrition and getting everything set. And then in the summer, it's irrigation, right? Keeping the trees watered and keeping the pests off the trees. That's all we're doing.
Mm.
So our energy doesn't, even the work we do doesn't go into the fruit. It all goes into protecting that fruit,
Right.
keeping the fruit attached, keeping the fruit healthy, keeping the fruit pest free, full of water, full of nutrients. All we're doing is setting the environment. And so the word for me is not grower, but it's cultivator,
Mm.
because that's actually the work that I do. The very practical, when I get up tomorrow morning, what I'm going to go do is I'm going to go continue to cultivate my orchard. The tree, well, I guess they're still asleep. In a couple of weeks, they'll start waking up. By the time this podcast come out, the tree will be growing walnuts, but I will not be.
Mm.
So that's the first thing, and we really root into that, and a lot of that also came in our time in Christian ministry, where we were focused a lot on conversations about soulfulness with people, and we were reacting at that time to a model of ministry that was very directive and instructive,
Mhm.
um, and we were trying to take a different sense and say, well, instead of telling people what to do or think, let's cultivate whatever's inside of them and follow wherever that leads. So that was kind of the first place, because that was our first reference point. Then, of course, in agriculture, it makes even more sense to take on that word,
Yeah.
cultivate. That's the first part. Soil. Soil is life, man. I mean, we can't get away from it. I think we even mentioned it last week a little bit. Like if there was not 6 inches of topsoil on the surface of the earth, none of us would be alive,
Right.
just point blank.
Right.
So soil is life. So we got to cultivate soil, right? That's just, and we'll have other episodes and other guests on who talk more about that, but that's just point blank. We got to cultivate soil.
Right.
Soul, again, I mean, our breakneck pace of culture, we don't take care of us, right? So we're seeing anxiety, we're seeing mental illnesses, we're seeing increase in therapies and pharmaceuticals just going through the roof because we as a human species have forgotten how to cultivate soulfulness.
Mm.
Or perhaps we didn't forget, perhaps we never knew.
Yeah.
City, because there tends to be this false divide between rural and urban, between those of kind of the monastic uh, wilderness and the busy urban hub. Um, but the city is a place where we come together. The city is a place where we become community. The city is a place where we engage in arts and culture. The city is a place where it's all drawn together.
Mm.
And so the city is not something at odds with the countryside. the urban dweller is not at odds with the rural dweller, or I should say, they don't have to be. And
Okay.
so for us, this idea of what does it mean to cultivate all of these three things together is really this merging of a vision of a renewed earth, right? Of the sense of like, there can be a different way of moving in the world than we currently move in the world. And it doesn't require leaving out any of the things that we love, right? Because there's proponents on one side or the other that, there's people who would love to never have to grow food in soil ever again. They want to do everything in vertical farms and other stuff. And
Mm.
there'll be a place for that in the growing world, but not exclusively to it only, although some people would encourage that. Then there's other people who think that, we should just, all move out of cities and just abandon the whole city experiment altogether and go back to living in the woods with skins, and that's just unrealistic and unsustainable for the human population
I
as
wouldn't
well.
last a day.
Well, honestly, I wouldn't either. I wouldn't either. Um, so for us, it is this inclusive sense, right? That we want to bring the whole earth, the whole human, and the whole conglomerate of humanity called culture, all on this journey of cultivating and renewing and increasing.
Yeah. I love, there's a couple of things that you mentioned there that as I'm listening and I'm thinking of even in my own life, I love that you said right now, the trees are asleep. Like, what an actual thing that I don't ever associate with trees, but it's true. The trees are asleep. They're going to wake up,
Yeah.
and what a great, almost humanitarian way to approach trees, right? They're sleeping. My son and I were on a walk the other day, and this tree is just in full bloom, and I
Mm,
didn't even look up and notice it. And my son said, "Dad, that
mm,
tree is just beautiful." And I looked up and it's like, oh my gosh, yeah, the tree's awake. I guess it's time for the trees to start waking up. But the way that you said that, I didn't think of it that way, but it's exactly what you said. It's like, oh, the tree's starting to wake up. And what a beautiful picture of what's happening around you and how I love this idea that you're cultivating it, right? I don't grow anything. And just serendipitously today, we had one of our business partners over, and out in front of our house we have a kind of a hydroponic tower. So this was one of our homeschool experiments. Is we're gonna get this tower and we're gonna put it all together, and we're gonna have the pump at the bottom pumping all the water up, and we're gonna grow strawberries, and we're gonna grow little basil and all these little things in this tower. And he asked me, he's like, Are you doing anything? Because it's just barren right now. There's just nothing there. It's just this tower of plastic and rock. And I said, I don't know, because as much time as I spent with electricity running that pump 24/7, trying to put the nutrients in the water, maintaining the water levels and all this thing, you're right. It's a cultivator. And I think we got like 3 strawberries off of that. And speaking of deer, like you painted a very romantic picture of deer, but I got a real love-hate relationship with deer. Let me just tell you that when they're trying to eat my little urban garden here.
so true. So true.
but it unlocked something for me that I was kind of resenting a little bit. Like, man, I just spent so much time and energy and money on that dang little vertical garden. But you're right. It's like I wasn't responsible for growing any of that. I was just there to cultivate it, to water it, to nurture it, to make sure that dang pump was plugged in. And then we're gonna see what's gonna happen. Oh, and to fence it off, which we
Yeah.
learned.
Yep. Yep.
To protect it. But it is such. I wouldn't trade the experience, and I actually want to do it more, because I think I've shared with you my grandparents. I grew up on kind of a smaller farm, and my grandparents had gardening, and it's such a good memory. I'm like, I think I need to get back to my roots. Pardon the pun
Isn't
there.
isn't that an interesting image right there too, right?
It really
Speaking of
is.
metaphors that we carry with us,
Yeah,
got to get back to our roots. What does that mean?
absolutely. I know that's a good one. Well, we can probably unpack that more, but uh, I want to move on here a little bit and talk about, now you've turned me on to this book called The Unsettling of America.
Mm,
And I believe that's Wendell Berry. Is that correct? The author is Wendell Berry.
absolutely.
Uh,
Absolutely.
now you're taking a swig of whiskey, and it's very important that you do that right now. And I think you're trying to cue me. I'm listening to the Audible version, which is read, speaking of whiskey, by Nick Offerman,
Mm,
and it's just fantastic.
what a
Uh,
voice to listen to for 12
oh my
hours.
gosh, it's
Mm.
it's It's really great. Just have a fireplace going in the background, and I'm there. And it's interesting because it feels like this book was written in a different time, but it's almost speaking to our time right now. And for folks that might be interested in this, I encourage you to go read it. I'm still working my way through it, but
So prescient, right?
it's
I
it's
think it came out in
in
1977.
in the 70s. Yeah, I mean
Yeah,
over 40 years ago,
yeah.
and
Oh,
it's almost prophetic in a way, I think.
oh, yeah. So much so.
But I was walking along, and it hit this one part, and I remember as I was walking, I stopped, I pulled out my phone, and I texted you like this mind-blowing moment of this concept that he talked about, where he talks about the specialist.
Mm,
And I'm gonna, but I'd love for you to talk about that specialist and what that means and how that relates to maybe what you're doing. But you also mentioned generalists, and kind of maybe
mhm.
compare those for us and talk a little bit about specialists versus a generalist.
Yeah, yeah. Wendell he's an amazing agro philosopher, and moralist, which is he's just a hoot to listen to, and his novels are a delight too, especially if you don't like any plot but just care a lot about character.
You got, and that's one thing you really got to sit in it. It's a, I
Yeah.
think, almost like a metaphor for farming. It's a slower pace that you got to kind of work your way into, but once you get in there, boy, you're kind of lost in the trees, for lack
Yeah,
of
and
a
I,
better
I
term.
I feel like, I haven't talked to Wendell about it, and I wish I could just sit down. Speaking of a fireplace with whiskey, I wish I could just sit down and have a conversation with him.
Mm,
But I read his works as being very intentional in that, almost in the Jesus sense of he who has ears, let him hear. Right?
yeah.
He writes in a way that those who are too busy to pay attention to what matters aren't going to hear what he has to say about what matters.
Mm,
He's written to the listener who's ready to hear, and he knows that,
yeah.
and unapologetically, to the point where he doesn't even acknowledge it in any of the writing that I've come across so far. But it seems purposeful to me, and other people who know him better can correct me. On our Patreon, speaking of,
Oh yes.
jump in there, join our Patreon, tell me how wrong I am about Wendell Berry, and I'll probably send you some merch or something. Um,
Love it.
but yeah, so this idea of an expert, to me, is a subset of kind of this larger framework, both in my approach to farming and to this podcast, and this idea of like creating a positive framework for exploration, right? And so one of the things is that, like, specialists know a lot about one thing, and they tend to box other people out. They say, well,
Mm,
because you don't know as much as me, we can't have a conversation about that because I'm the expert, right? But when Wendell talks about it, he talks about it in very extensive ways, but quickly. He talks about the experts as being good at one particular thing, and generalists are inherently the opposite of specialists, and that farmers are inherently generalists. That
mm.
farmers have to be part-time mechanics, part-time gardeners, part-time husbandry, livestock, raisers, have to be a part-time accountant, part-time bookkeeper, part-time tax guy, part-time regulatory, part-time marketer, part-time everything, right? You have to be,
Salesperson.
yeah,
Yeah, you got to sell yourself.
you've got to be a generalist
Yeah.
to be a farmer. And what the specialist does, and we've seen this in industrialized farming, it says you need to hand over part of your skills and therefore part of your competency and therefore part of your character
Mm,
to me. I will now tell you when to spray in your orchard. I will now tell you where to sell your product to market. I will now tell you. So, and Wendell takes us all the way to the extreme. He talks about kind of the person then who has so offloaded themselves, and he describes character in these very practical terms, right? He talks about it in the sense of like expertise and skill and competence and all the and experience and all these things.
yeah.
But when we offload that to other people, then all that's left for the individual then is to make money and be entertained. Well, they then make money as a specialist themselves, and they're entertained by specialists. They send their children to specialists for education. Their food comes from specialists, manufactured and heated up in the microwave. And so then the whole framework of life becomes dominated by an ecosystem of specialists, to the point later on that a conversation about becoming generalists is like speaking in a foreign language, because the ecosystem doesn't support it. The ecosystem only supports an awareness of and participation with specialists. So any kind of alternative conversation feels radical and shattering, when really it's very, very normal.
Yeah.
It's just different. So for me, and in this podcast, and maybe that was a little bit of an aside, but this idea of creating this positive framework for exploration is really leaning into normalizing what it means to be a generalist, and saying, I don't have all the answers. I certainly don't have I don't have the answers about podcasts or farming or spirituality or manhood or parenthood or anything else. I do not have the answers. But I'm a generalist. I dabble. And so it's this idea of like, to me, it ties into gatekeepers. And gatekeepers are kind of one of those words. But for me, I see gatekeepers popping up everywhere. And of course, in my own spiritual tradition, there's gatekeepers left, right, and center. But even in popular culture, there's gatekeepers, right? There's people who a gatekeeper essentially says, if you don't think or act the way that I think or act, you are excluded from the group, right? So someone in the church might say, if you don't believe that the Bible is the inerrant word of God, right? That's a thought that they have. Then you're not really a Christian. So now they just created a gate that keeps you in or out of their gate that they made.
Yeah.
Right. Pop culture, you could look at either politically, you could look at any end of the spectrum, right? There's both conservative and liberal gatekeepers who say the same thing. They say, if you don't think or act the way we think or act, you're not part of us. Well, gatekeeping, I'm going on a monologue. Is that all right, Chris?
You go.
Monologue. All right.
You go. I was my next question was unpack this gatekeeping for us. So
let's go. Okay, so I'm going to keep going. Okay, so gatekeepers exist everywhere, but gatekeeping always leads to dogmatic beliefs. And what I mean by that is a dogma is essentially codified gatekeeping. It's when the gatekeepers get together and write it down. That becomes dogma, right? But dogmatic beliefs always get to a place where the dogma itself becomes resistant to truth seeking. So now what the dogma says is, don't go looking for the truth, just adhere to the dogma. Okay, so let's give a couple examples. Let's go back to, let's say, so the inerrancy of scripture, right? So let's talk about that a little bit. So the dogma says scripture is the inerrant word of God. That's a dogmatic belief. Now, the truth can quest from there. Now, the truth might ultimately agree with that, maybe not, because the truth is not bound to the dogma. The truth is just out there to be sought and found by whoever would go seek it. Dogma and gatekeepers say, if you turn your nose away from adhering to the dogma to sniff out any other avenue, then you're out. Get out of here. You violated the dogma. You're no longer included. We can talk about that when we look at whether it's police brutality or if it's Black Lives Matter. There are sacred cows in both of those circles. There are dogmas that say, nope, you just believe this or else you're out. You can't be, if you examine that, if you look at it closer, if you ask more questions about it, then you betray us and you're out. So dogma always resists truth seeking because the truth might just break the gate that the gatekeeper is trying to keep closed. And the truth has a way of doing that.
And let's look what's behind that gate. There's a lot of power. There's a lot of influence.
There really is. Yeah. And I mean, maybe we could have a whole other episode on how Gatekeepers create dogma, that create institutions, that create systems, that create
Mm,
religions. Because to me, that's a scaffold that, goes all the way to the top in every realm of life. But you're right. There's a
yeah.
lot of power. There's a lot of control behind those dogmas.
That's
But
and
the
that.
other thing that dogmatic beliefs do is that they always resist freedom,
Mm,
because dogmas are inherently bound and freedom is inherently unbound.
okay.
So even if we take a dogma, a set of strict beliefs that claim to be about freedom, let's say Second Amendment rights,
Okay.
by the very nature of the dogmatic beliefs of Second Amendment defenders, they are resisting freedom because freedom can only be bound within their dogma in their
Mm,
minds. When actual freedom extends beyond, includes, and usurps their dogma.
mm.
So
Need to sit
there's
in that for a bit. Yeah. Wow. Shoot. Dang.
well, I guess I want to talk about this right now because I feel within myself and my own personality, my wiring,
Mm-hmm.
I love to be an expert and I love to be exclusive.
Mm,
I feel that person inside of me. I feel the dogmatic person. I feel the gatekeeper.
yeah.
I feel the specialist inside of me. And I'm learning how to have conversations with that part of myself. But I really enjoy the image of creating a world that is free from that,
Mm,
and that's free from that part of myself. I want to step into a world where I am free from those parts of me
mm,
that would seek to control other people or even myself.
yeah.
And so for me, I want this podcast to be a place where there aren't silly questions, right? Because
Mm,
all of us learned something at some point,
yeah.
right? Chris, the
Yeah.
fact that you know something I don't know, the only thing that tells us about is that you're a different person than me.
Mm-hmm.
It says nothing about who's smarter or who's more able or who's anything. It just says we're different people,
Right.
which is the most obvious thing in the world.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so I really want this podcast to be that kind of a place where you can hold me like to task on that, right? When you
Mm-hmm.
feel me start to gatekeeping and you feel me start to go dogmatic, or you feel me start to play the role of the expert, that you can just be like, hang on, Kaben, you poop in the same toilet.
Dang.
Uh,
You put your pants on one leg at a time, fella.
and hopefully then we can create a space that feels open and truth seeking to everyone listening.
Well, and I told you this is one of the things when we were prepping for season 2 that I feel like I actually journeyed with you in season 1, in that I would walk a lot and I would listen to the podcast for season 1, and it was an actual journey for me. And it's interesting that you bring up the point of dogma and asking questions, because there's growing up in the Christian evangelical Christian faith, uh very thankful for that in a way, and also there's a lot of fear that was baked into that. So the idea of asking questions is a very dangerous place to start for me anyway, because there's a lot of insecurity in there, right? Like, well, what if I just start asking questions and that just upends everything that I believe, and then what was the point of the last 40 years that I've been living? And my mind just goes down that trail.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I've appreciated about almost the safeness of this space is it's okay to ask some questions, and exactly what you said, it's okay if we're different people, and I don't have to draw the same conclusions that you do, and you don't have to draw the same conclusions that I do, but that's okay, and that we can hold space and have those conversations and still walk away like mutual respect, mutual understanding. And there's so many of, I told you this, I guess, last season, that just by hearing their opinion, it helped unlock some understanding of relationships that I have that are very close to me, that I
Mhm.
wouldn't have understood and I wouldn't have gotten deeper insight had I not heard these conversations, and had I not heard these questions being asked. So the idea of maybe it's going to be uncomfortable, maybe it's going to be a little bit painful to step out there. Please do. And if I can say anything, just what I'm learning from what you're, these exercises that you're taking us through, the exercises of not being afraid to say, hey, let's acknowledge creation for what it is. Let's acknowledge creator, however you do that. And that's, for me, I'm learning to say that's okay if your expression is different than my expression.
Mm-hmm.
And we can talk about that, and there might be some things that I learned from you, and maybe you'll learn something from me, but at the end of the day, we're different people. And
Mm-hmm.
let's ask those questions and seek to understand. So I'm super excited about this. I'm going on a little bit. We're kind of at time here, so I want to make sure that we're kind of ending on time. But anything that we should be looking forward to as we're kind of continuing this journey, Kaben, as we're looking forward.
Man, check us out ending on time. So we've
Trying.
actually try. We've actually already recorded 4 guest interviews, which I'm super excited about. They're just really going to be fantastic, incredible people that you guys are going to be able to hear from on this podcast. And I had an amazing group of guests in season 1, and I didn't think I could match it. And then here we are 4 in on season 2, and my mind is blown. It's going to be some really fun conversations. Again, if you want to know more about kind of Tenderly Rooted, our website is just www.tenderlyrooted.com. While I'm at it, I'll also say this podcast has a website. It's just www.ofdustanddivinity.com. Go there. There's show notes there. You'll find like references to all the books and stuff we've talked about, maybe some other clips. Importantly, also, there's a link into our Patreon, which we love hanging out and just getting in conversation with you guys. That's a great place to disagree with us. We love having those conversations. And then there's also just bonus content, right? So there's going to be some recorded conversations where people give some pushback and challenge. And yeah, there's a lot of ways for you as you're listening to this. If any of this is pinging on you, obviously, please leave a rating and review. Before I had a podcast, I thought, man, people are just selling me a line. Like people are just looking to butter their own bread with my rating and review. Now that I'm producing and creating a podcast, I'm realizing like it's not buttering my bread. It is the bread and butter. I mean,
Right.
it's the thing that keeps the podcast alive. It really is important in the way that, the technological world and the algorithms have wired things. Man, if people listen to this and they think in their head that was cool, and then don't go leave a rating and review, then there's other people who aren't going to hear that it was cool, right? Who might want to.
Yeah.
So absolutely jump on, however you listen to this podcast, it's everywhere. Just jump on, leave a rating and review. We'd love that. And then again, hop on a Patreon, let us know you dropped a rating and review. We'd love to just send you a thank you card and just let you know what our thoughts on that. And just, it'd be a great way for us to connect as well. So yeah, please do that. And then again, if you just hit that share button on however you listen to it, again, it's crazy with the algorithm, but if you're on however you're listening to it and you hit that share button from that source and send it as a text message or Facebook message to someone else, that does just miracles behind the scenes as far as helping other people beyond the person you sent it to find the podcast who would also enjoy it. So share it, subscribe to it, leave a review, and that then other people like us can connect and keep going on this journey together.
And please join the conversation. We want to hear that. Questions that you've got for Kaben, put them in there. I'll ask him. He said nothing's off limits, so I might be putting words in your mouth, but
no, you're not.
You were taking a swig of whiskey, so I figured I'd take the opportunity. But no, we're excited to do that. And one of the things that we've talked about, and we'll see if it comes to fruition, is even having some listeners join in for some extras on the Patreon, and just maybe having a bit of a roundtable and fleshing out maybe some of these concepts a little bit more. So we're excited about that.
And we also talked, one of the ideas, I guess we're kind of now spitballing, Chris, but we'd also even talked about this idea of like, maybe some people who interact with us in some certain ways on Patreon, like we might even send them some free merch. And when I say merch, let me be clear, we're talking about Tenderly Rooted, because, we sell our walnuts direct to consumer. We have our own packaging, and we're in a couple of grocery stores. And so of course, and we also have like hats and shirts and other stuff. And so, we would love to kind of send some of that merch to some people on Patreon as well.
And I'll say it, if you're looking for a way to support small farming and farmers, this is a great way to do it. So and I can tell you, my wife and we have had those walnuts and high praise from
You want to know
wife,
a crazy stat, Chris?
from
This blows my mind, even though like I know it. It still blows my mind. It's one of those things that's like, is true, but you don't feel like should be true. If we could just sell 5% of our crop direct to consumer,
yeah,
it would equal the 95% of our crop that we have to sell in the commodity market.
No kidding.
I mean, we can have a whole conversation about how farmers get screwed in the commodity market.
Wow.
But that's how badly we get screwed.
Buy walnuts, people. Tenderly. All right, that's another conversation that we got to have, because that's fascinating to me, and I didn't even know that. So I'm looking forward to having that conversation. But thank you, Kaben, for letting me, kind of pick your brain a little bit here on some of these concepts, for letting us, promote what you guys are doing, the hard work that you're doing, and just giving us some more insight into the soil and the soul and the city and all that good stuff. So thank you so much.
Absolutely, guys. And hang around for next week's episode. It's going to be fantastic.
Awesome. We'll see you next time.